America is withdrawing from Afghanistan, a war in which the Taliban would often say, "You have the clocks and we have the time." This war on terror that unfolded over 20 years was a learning process for all. We learned that ideology matters, especially as militant threats go online and mobilize globally. We learned that while wars can be traditionally lost, it is less clear that can be traditionally won in the battlefield. The first war on terror, the first war in which NATO's Article 5 was evoked, was the last war we fought with the confidence of unquestionable political consensus on both sides of the Atlantic. Through its partnership with the Policy and International Affairs of the University of Maine, Tactics hopes to engage academics and practitioners at a seminar moment for the study of terrorism. Multipolarism challenges a number of perceptions: legitimate violence and legitimate resistance, what nations perceive versus what is the reality of conflict, our understanding of the West as community of Euro-Atlantic partners sharing a common worldview. In today's discussion, I propose two rounds of a conversation that will be supported by a panel of experts who have so much wisdom and knowledge on this topic. One focusing on how the world has changed, which will be the first round of discussion, and the second round of our discussion will be regarding the question of how we, the West, can change the world or are already changing the world. Before we begin, allow me to introduce our wonderful panelists. Professor Kenneth Hillas has served until 2013 as Senior Foreign Service Officer for the U.S. State Department. During his career, he served as the Deputy Chief of Mission and Charge of the U.S. Embassy in Prague and the U.S. Embassy in Warsaw, Poland. He has served as the State Department's Deputy Special Negotiator for Eurasian conflicts, mediating the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh. His work on conflict resolution also focused on Abkhazia and Transnistria, Moldova. Professor Hillas also teaches at the Graduate School of Policy and International Affairs at the University of Maine. Welcome, Professor Hillas. Dr. Laura Pittman. She holds a PhD in International Studies from Old Dominion University and has published multiple peer-reviewed articles with a focus on international security and cybersecurity. Her research interests include human safety and its relevance to national and international security, disinformation, and other existing and future cognitive warfare techniques. As a subject matter expert, Dr. Pittman worked on different projects on disinformation sponsored by NATO and by the US Department of State. Dr. Pittman currently is also an adjunct assistant professor at the University of Maine teaching international and cybersecurity classes. Welcome. Dr. William Farrell holds a PhD from the University of Maine with a focus on political science and international affairs. He has worked in leadership positions in multilateral organizations and for the United States government for the past 25 years. Earlier in his career, Dr. Farrell was seconded by the US Department of State to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, where he was engaged in the formal peace negotiation between Georgians and Southern Ossetians, as well as between Tajiks during the civil war in Tajikistan. He has conducted field research in large parts of the Sahel, Caucasus, and Central Asia for concrete ways in which development assistance can be used to counter violent extremist activity, build stability, and support national cohesion. Dr. Farrell is also a professor at the University of Maine for the School of Policy and International Affairs. Welcome. Professor Seth Singleton is an adjunct professor of international relations at the University of Maine. He has been faculty research associate at Harvard University and academic dean in universities in the US and overseas. His research has focused on Russia, China, and Africa. He won the American Political Science Association Prize for Best Dissertation in International Relations. He has lived and worked at universities in Tanzania, Russia, Ecuador, and Vietnam, and consulted in China, Mongolia, and Bolivia. Welcome all. It is a pleasure to have you all here.
Very much.
Thank you.
Allow me to begin with the first round of our discussions regarding how the world has changed and how is this connected to modern terrorism. Professor Hillas, the war on terror once brought together President Putin and President Bush behind a common cause. Can you imagine a world where this kind of consensus might re-emerge?
The short answer is yes, but maybe I have a very fertile imagination. But I guess the topic is how the world has changed. I think is a good place to start from. Um, First, I think we need to be mindful that the world is always changing. Societies and states aren't static things. They involve human interaction and perceptions, and the pace of technological change in recent years has only accelerated the change in world affairs. I make the point because many observers and even some policymakers, I think, on both sides in Washington and Moscow, often make the mistake of thinking that the relationship's not changeable for historic, geographic, cultural, economic reasons. And a corollary of this is projecting past trends into the future. It's a trap that leads to sort of a dead end for policymakers who have to anticipate where the world is headed, or at least what can reasonably be achieved in the world. That said, there are limits on the ability of any country to shape the course of events and relationships. I can imagine a US-Russian relationship that is very different from the one that has existed now for nigh on 20 years. But I don't see terrorism as being the nexus for achieving that. Terrorism is unlikely to bring Russia and the United States into a cooperative enterprise, if only because the terrorism that concerns them is different. Their understanding of what the character of the terrorist threat is different, it's not likely to bring some kind of coordinated joint approach on the question of terrorism. Terrorism is in many ways is sort of a very fudgy thing to deal with. I think you have to talk about specific terrorist threats and not a broad one. It's interesting that it was under President Medvedev, not actually President Putin, where the brief and sort of admittedly limited apex of US-Russian cooperation sort of reached its climax, whether it was in the UN dealing with the question of the war in Libya, or with regard to the Northern Distribution Network, where the United States was able to find a route for the flow of logistical assistance to NATO forces in Afghanistan, which transited the Russian Federation as well as other East European and Central Asian countries. That was under President Medvedev, not under President Putin. I mean, there was a few nice phone calls, and President Bush's first summit with President Putin in Ljubljana, Slovenia. Bush came away somewhat starry-eyed, said he'd looked into Putin's eyes and read his soul somehow. Lest we forget that presidents other than Trump have engaged in hyperbole at times. But if the question is what could catalyze U.S.-Russian cooperation, there are sort of two central lines, I think, that provide the most likely path by which you could see a more cooperative relationship. At present, well, there are two, yeah. So the first would be a perception of a common threat, which right now doesn't exist either with regard to terrorism or other major powers. And the second one, which I think is less likely, would be a change in the Russian political system that would bring it to a more democratic form. The problem is that the political opposition in Russia, if you look at Alexei Navalny, for all his good work in uncovering graft and corruption at the top levels of the Russian government, is himself a nationalist, and has at times spoken in rather harsh terms about Central Asians living and working in Russian. So he's a full-throated Russian nationalist, and I think you could expect he would act accordingly if somehow he were to come to power. As I said, that does at present that seems the less likely of the two ways that U.S. and Russia could develop a more cooperative relationship. And a change in the regime wouldn't necessarily bring about a government more prepared to work constructively with the West. Mm-hmm. Suspicions about the threat posed by NATO and even the European Union have fairly deep roots among the populace and the intelligentsia. More likely, I think, is the development of a common threat perception. Were China to displace the US as the dominant global power, which is something that's not unthinkable in the next 25 years, there would be implications for Russian security. Just as American dominance in global affairs in the post-Cold War world was the driver in increasingly close Russo-Chinese relations, so too could the rise of China fuel a Russian desire to balance off a dominant China, one which has historic claims on Russia's sparsely populated Far East. It would in some ways complete a cycle of balancing and counterbalancing that started in the 1970s with the Sino-US rapprochement to balance off what both countries viewed as a greater threat of the Soviet Union. And of course, we know what's happened with the development of a Russian-Chinese, what they refer to now as a strategic partnership in the 21st century, aimed at balancing off the United States. We'll have to see. I mean, there are a lot of variables in here. How China rises, progresses, how Russia responds to it, how the United States responds to it, and nothing's foreordained. But I guess the conclusion is I can see the possibility of closer U.S.-Russian relations. I just don't think terrorism is the most likely avenue by which that would be achieved.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Professor Hill. So in other words, of what I have understood, if we have the common threat being more clear and more straightforward for the nation states to know that they have to collaborate at the end of the day, and when we see that we have a disturbance in the global geopolitical game of chess, if I may say, because we have different players coming up as China, as you mentioned already, then maybe we'll see collaboration between the US and Russia. Did I understand that correctly?
Yes, and the operative word in there is maybe.
Maybe, of course. And this leads me to my second question, because we mentioned common threat, and this leads me to ask Dr. Pittman regarding terrorism, and maybe is there a phase in who is acting those kind of actions? And my question particularly is primarily about non-state actors. In a world of plausible deniability in which the state does not assume responsibility for its actions, can a state be accused of terrorism?
This is a very good question, actually, and we have observed both in the physical and in the cyberspace some attacks that could be labeled as terrorism. Of course, this is a very subjective notion. It's a very political decision whether or not you're going to call it exactly terrorism. But we have seen these attacks, terrorist attacks, both in cyberspace and in the physical space that were actually committed by individuals. But we can reasonably conclude sometimes that these individuals are actually working on state orders. For example, if an individual is working in a certain Ministry of Defense or Department of Defense, and they're committing, a cyber crime against another state, it could be labeled as act of terrorism. We can probably wonder if this was, in execution of some state order. And yes, to respond to your question, a state can be accused of terrorism, but I want to address whether it should be accused of terrorism. And there are two main issues related to this. The first one being the problem of diplomacy and the problem of prosecution. Now, diplomacy, you need to be very careful when you're accusing, other states of terrorism, right? Because this can damage your relationship. And the problem of prosecution is the following. You can successfully prosecute an individual who is physically located in a state with which you just don't have an extradition treaty. And every state has a few other states with which they don't have extradition treaties. And this is no coincidence. Usually states with antagonistic relationship, they usually don't have these extradition treaties. An example in this regard is the United States and Russia. What states sometimes do is that they lure the individual and to go to another country, and then they get arrested there. Now, what states should do if they are tempted to accuse another state of terrorism, they really carefully need to assess the overall relationship that they have with the state, the consequences that will follow from accusing a state of terrorism. Of course, this can have like a deterring effect, or it can also damage the relationship. It can lead to a lot of tension. It can lead to hostilities. It can lead to tension and very serious problems overall.
Thank you, Dr. Pittman. So only if we see maybe a huge disturbance, and maybe when we see real loss of human lives, then we might consider terrorism at the end of the day, cyber terrorism in this case. Thank you very much. And that was a very interesting insight, actually. Can I continue with Professor Farrell? And I want to ask, do you feel values and transformational aspirations are still important in American foreign policy, or is the emerging world much more transactional in nature? I would love to hear your insight in that case.
Karina, thanks for the question. Like foreign policy, including American foreign policy, has always been at one level transactional, right? Sure, we have our stalwart friends. You think about allies like Great Britain or France, and then maybe we have an outer ring of places that have an historical special relationship with us, such as Taiwan. But we also have a constellation of friends, relationships that are strategic, for commerce or for competition with other powers, or for campaigns like the global war on terrorism. And then if you think about underlying all of these relationships is this fundamental belief that promoting liberal democratic values, and here I mean things like equality and justice and human rights and democratic processes. The fundamental belief is that promotion of all of these things makes countries more stable, and where systems are more alike, there's a greater affinity and the greater connections are possible. I don't see these values and these transformational aspirations that you mentioned in conflict with one another, but I do think there's a necessary dose of pragmatism. So, societal transformation it's a long-term project that it can be encouraged by external parties like the United States or others, but it still needs to be desired internally. And sometimes this multi-generational time horizon needed for societal transformation outstrips the political will, it outstrips the resources, and it outstrips the needs of external countries like the United States. So look at the contemporary example that you've brought up of Afghanistan. But even in even when the United States or Europe encourages progression towards certain values through linkage and leverage, as political scientists like to say, there's this countervailing factor, particularly from competitors like Russia or China that pull them in a different direction. So certainly, if you think about efforts like Russia's Eurasian Economic Union or China's Belt and Road Initiative, these create greater connection to partner countries. societies, right? And increasing that connection, there's a greater opportunity for influence, not only politically and economically, but also value-based influence. So if you examine the pressures in places like Ukraine or Georgia, you readily hear competitive value-based narratives come out in conversation. So traditional values versus Western values, Eastern values, or Eastern and Western orientation, spheres of influence and the competitive nature of great powers is still prevalent. It hasn't gone away. It's still a prevalent force. And so it's no surprise that that the values and transformational aspirations are still in play, right? But I would say that our public debate and political jockeying that you see here in the United States, which are truly hallmarks of democratic societies, these could be giving people abroad at the moment some pause regarding our commitment to those values that you mentioned. So things like, where does the United States stand on equality and justice under the law when it comes to minorities? Is there trust and confidence in our electoral processes? Do we respect freedom of speech, or simply conformity? So recent history, I mean, if you think about this past year, and particularly this pressure cooker of the COVID year, it's really raised the temperature on public disagreement. And for some, as you look abroad, they may see this as a fraying of our society and a retreat from some of our values, rather than, as I would put it, being part of that continual refinement of our democratic experiment. So again, I don't see, Karina, the United States departing from either its values-based worldview or its pragmatism. And in fact, a continued lean towards spheres of influence would suggest that values are, in fact, an important competitive differentiator for the United States.
Thank you, Professor Farrell. And at the end of the day, it's about a healthy balance. You needed to have a strategic goal, but also you need to share some common values and aspirations as nation states. Thank you very much for this interesting, not only insight, but also you mentioned the BRI initiative. Just a small comment. For me, it's also a soft diplomacy act. We are helping you build with our aid or our foreign direct investment your villages, but we are also, in a way, creating a cultural tie, maybe at the end of the day, something more for the future. Allow me to continue with a question for Professor Singleton. There is a perception that home affairs and national security challenges are becoming indistinguishable. In such a world, do we double down on international cooperation, or do we cut off the rest of the world in order to gain back control of our threats?
There we go.
Perfect.
Karina, great question. Try it this way. We have two things going on at once. One is that people resent control of their lives and communities by distant, unaccountable power centers that don't understand them and don't have their interests in mind. So the cry is take back control. We see this in Europe, certainly Brexit, and in resistance everywhere to economic globalization, which destroys jobs and uproots communities and enriches only a faraway few. But also, the world is increasingly connected by communication and travel and shared information and trade and the flow of money from one place to another. This isn't going to stop, because that would mean undoing the technology that shapes our daily lives. We get up in the morning. We take a drink from a plastic cup. We swallow our medicines. We get dressed. We turn on the internet to connect with our family and follow the news. Every bit of this depends on international supply chains, transnational scientific research, and global communication networks. Now, almost all of our serious problems are one and the same: time, home affairs, and international. Climate change, obviously, financial flows, including tax evasion and money laundering, human trafficking and drugs and other organized crime, spread of false and misleading information to stir up hate and hostility and division, hacking and cyber theft, migration and terrorism. and they all can be considered security issues. Terrorism, by the way, is just one of the global problems that can't be solved one nation at a time. Terrorist networks are transnational and local, but almost never national. You can't uproot Al-Qaeda or ISIS by police work in Britain or the EU or the US or Mali or Mozambique or Afghanistan or Syria, each acting separately. Now I'll take a leap. Nation states, which, yes, will be with us for a long time, are obsolete. They remind me of medieval baronies at the end of the Middle Ages. Then technology and economy expanded beyond the village serf and handicrafts economy. So medieval fiefdoms had to be replaced by something bigger. And they were. It took a long time and it was a huge mess. We now face a similar transition. Technology and economic exchange is global, beyond the scope of sovereign nations. We have no idea what transnational political forms will emerge, and as again, it's almost certain that the process will be messy. So what about those stubborn human beings who don't want to be pushed around by distant, unaccountable, powerful people and institutions they can't control? The classic solution is some form of federalism. Leave it to the locals, that which is local, and empower the center to cope with what must be regulated for the whole. Federalism is very difficult and very imperfect. For example, the unbreakable union of Soviet republics disintegrated. The EU bumps and stumbles. Ethiopia breaks down into civil war. The US did that too once. But the assumption that national sovereignty with hard borders is still workable, if it ever was workable, seems mistaken. We need something more local and culturally focused and also more global. We need fluid political units. Consider the UK. Britain exits the EU, but then Scotland may separate from England and rejoin Europe, and Northern Ireland needs to be linked somehow to both Ireland and England. The most difficult issue, by the way, will probably be migration. Climate change will give migration a push, but the main drivers are probably population growth outrunning local food and water supply, and above all, bad government, enabling violence and gender abuse. We have no way to manage migration. The compassionate solution, welcome all refugees as refugees, all those suffering violence and gender abuse, would open borders to eventually hundreds of millions of migrants in a continuing flow. That's unworkable. Governments in Asia, by the way, which are rich, don't even consider taking in refugees. Consider rules for terrorism. To prevent terrorism by cooperation among sovereign nations, you have to agree who is a terrorist and who is not, and enforce a common set of rules. The national system isn't capable of that. To the Chinese government, all Uyghurs agitating against China are terrorists. To the Syrian government, all armed opponents and their sympathizers are terrorists. Turkey says any follower of the Gulen movement is a terrorist. Are the Taliban terrorists? The United States negotiates with them. They certainly target Afghan civilians. Westerners, by cultural habit, form committees and legislatures. The EU, for example, or originally the UN, and try to make rules by agreement. They accept imperfect compromises and partial solutions, or else live with no agreement at all. Often this just doesn't work, and it's less likely to work in a world where power is dispersed among nations with different cultural traditions. Chinese, by contrast, hold that a wise central authority should make and enforce the rules. Obedience is required, disobedience is punished. China champions sovereignty and central control and the power of existing governments under all circumstances. The Chinese response to the problems of global externalities, terrorism or migration or financial destabilization or unwanted information or transnational religious belief has been to isolate China. In the next phase, if all goes as Chinese leaders hope and expect, a walled-off sovereign China will set general rules drawing on Chinese wisdom and enforced by Chinese dominance in the world economy. The UN and other international institutions will be co-opted. The first rule is that every government must control its citizens as China does. And that's the way you're going to solve all these problems. This will uphold world stability and security. We will have global harmony with Chinese characteristics. Now, I don't think that's going to happen, but it is in fact an effort to figure out what to do about the problem of the transnational and the local. Stop there for now.
On the first round, and now we're going to discuss on how we can change the world, or how are we changing the world already. Professor Hillas, it is said that Russia placed a bounty on US soldiers in Afghanistan. Is that an act of war or a terrorist act? And given America's past with the Mujahideen, what is the takeaway for American foreign policy?
Well, I think this was a very topical question up until a few weeks ago. In recent weeks, the US intelligence community has not found confirmation that Moscow placed a bounty on US soldiers in Afghanistan. That seemed credible shows you the extent to which US-Russian relations have descended. If it had been true, or if it had occurred, I think it would have been a very dangerous move for Russia to make. Whether it would be considered an act of war really depends on the administration in power in Washington. Not every government is going to respond the same way to something as marginal as bounties. I mean, Pearl Harbor type attacks leave no room for any equivocation on the part of an administration, but when you're dealing with terrorism or with countries supporting terrorists, sometimes it's more of a gray area. And it depends really on not just the act itself, but the extent to which one country wants to avoid going to war with another country. I mean, especially a country like Russia possessing the largest number of nuclear weapons in the world. Anyone. So on the question of I'll come back to the question of terrorism and Afghanistan. I think maybe if I understand your correctly, your question focuses on how Russian-American actions and reactions have affected, or how we've affected our own bilateral relationship and how that has affected the world. And so to start with, I think it's important that we not think of Russia as truly a superpower, because economically, technologically, demographically, it's falling farther and farther behind. Yes, it still has the largest number of nuclear weapons and the systems, missile systems to deliver them. And it certainly has improved its conventional combat capability over the last decade or a little bit more, after letting it fall far from where it stood in 1990. But Russia today is in many ways more isolated from the rest of the world. It has virtually no allies. Even Belarus is often a thorn in Russia's side. Its ability to project power globally is quite limited. The deployment of Russian forces to Syria is an exception, not the rule, because Russia had a naval and an air base in Tartus on the Syrian coast before the Syrian civil. I mean, it'd been there since Soviet days. It's one of the few foreign military bases that Russia was able to continue maintaining. And it helped provide essential logistics and infrastructure to support the deployment of Russian military forces to Syria. Without it, I think it would have been a much steeper hill for Russia to climb. I'm not sure they could have operated in Syria the way they did since 2015. That said, Russia is viewed as a threat by many NATO states, especially the Balts and East European countries. Russian activities in Ukraine, including the annexation of Crimea, have worked against some of Russia's strategic interests, specifically, the aim of binding European states to Russia economically, especially through the construction of gas pipelines, Nord Stream and now Nord Stream 2 being the most recent examples. But Europe today is less reluctant than at any time since the end of the Cold War to stand up to Russian intimidation, to assign forces, rapid reaction forces to the Baltic states, something that 15 years ago when I was in Poland, Europeans would have given you the evil eye if you had suggested the idea. So things have progressed in a way that don't serve Russia's strategic interests. Now, successive U.S. administrations, starting with Clinton through Bush to Obama and even Trump, have started out determined to move bilateral relations in a positive direction, only to have ties with Moscow deteriorate. Trump may have tried hardest of all at the first summit in Helsinki that he had with Putin. He accepted Putin's denials of election interference in the 2016 election, contradicting his own intelligence community's findings. But in essence, all these administrations I just mentioned were unwilling to acquiesce in a Russian zone of privileged relations with the states of the former Soviet Union. And given Russia's historic desire, or what they would probably argue is a need for defense in depth, that strategic Russian interest could never be reconciled. And even if in the few years after the end of communism, there was a brief hope of an open democratic Russia that felt secure in the European family of nations, it rather quickly went away. So now coming back to the question of Afghanistan and terrorism, I'm, apart from Russia, I'm cautiously optimistic that a regime in Kabul that's dominated by the Taliban, and most people think that sooner or later after the US and withdraws, and so do other NATO states, all of whom have said they will follow the US in that regard. I'm confident that a regime in Kabul dominated by the Taliban would seek to avoid having its territory used to organize and launch terrorist attacks on the US. Yes, it would be the Taliban, and the Taliban haven't really changed their stripes in terms of their beliefs, but I think there is an awareness that they would be much easier targets sitting in their offices in Kabul than they are nowadays hiding in the mountains. And I even think that that said, Afghanistan is and always has been central governments have had great difficulty in exercising their writ over the Afghan countryside, whether it was the king before 1979 or the communists who came to power after the king, or the Taliban, or recent Afghan governments. ISIS which operates in Afghanistan, is as much in conflict with the Taliban as it is with the Kabul regime. If there's a major power close to Afghanistan that fears an Islamist Afghan government more than the Americans, it would probably be China, and to a lesser degree, Russia. So the takeaway on Afghanistan, I think, for the US is, and President Biden sort of, I think, has this well pegged, is there's no clear definition of victory or even success for the United States in Afghanistan. And, to be honest about it, foreign affairs is often about managing problems, not solving them. States, solutions are quite often beyond the capabilities of any one state to achieve. And our experience in nation building, or national engineering, as some call it, is not something in which foreign states have, that we've had much success, or other states have had much success in. Few exceptions, perhaps, but that's more limited in smaller countries and different times as well. So I'll stop there, and having come back to the question of terrorism.
And as you said, it's about managing problems, not solving them. So thank you for your interesting answer, and allow me to continue with addressing Dr. Farrell. There is an emergence of far-right terrorism across the Western world that gets less press than jihadi terrorism, and we agree on that. What kind of coming together would that kind of war on terror require?
Thanks, Karina. As you say, there's been a pendulum swing in Western media in the last couple of years, with far-right violent extremism, or far-right terrorism, as you called it, taking a more pronounced share of the headlines, and in some analytical pieces. Now, part of that reason for this is that crimes by these groups and by people inspired by their messages are happening in familiar places, right? It's happening in places like Europe, or the United States, or New Zealand, and not necessarily in far-flung Nigeria, or Yemen, or Syria. So the relevance to those of us in the Western world of far-right or ultra-nationalist or white supremacist violence, or far-left violence, if you will, is much higher. And, and perhaps perception-wise, it's seen as more important, right? That's particularly so since the number of jihadi attacks in these same Western places has really been comparatively limited lately. Yeah, but I would caution us, in drawing global conclusions from our perceptions and from headlines. If you look at the data, for example, from the Global Terrorism database from START, you'll readily see that jihadi violence, or jihadi groups like Boko Haram and a myriad of Al-Qaeda affiliates, are still demonstrating their lethality exponentially higher than other current forms of terrorism. So at the moment, far-right terrorism still pales globally in comparison to jihadi terrorism. That said, being predictive and proactive are the cornerstones of good security policy. So to your question, Karina, how do we create a unified front or a coalition against far-right terrorism, similar to what was done with the global war on terrorism, which was arguably oriented towards the jihadi threat? Well, I think our first step needs to be a clearer definition of clearer and cleaner definition of the threat. We hear a conflating of terms ranging from far-right terrorism to alt-right terrorism to white supremacy to ultra-nationalist terrorism to neo-Nazis. Now, are they the same thing? What do these terms really mean? So in the public and political lexicon, I would say these are poorly defined and therefore poorly understood. So it's not uncommon, in fact, very common. I picked up a newspaper earlier today, and in the same article, you'll see multiple of these terms used interchangeably in the same media report, which really does blur the distinction of definitions and the distinction of meaning. So, to what extent, really how this is important, if you ask the question, to what extent are supporters of these groups energized by different things? So how, are they energized by a distrust of government or hatred of minorities or isolationism or xenophobia, or is it something else? So the outlines of the problem set need to be able to be differentiated between all of these things. I think as a second step, there needs to be more vigorous public discussion on what actually constitutes a threat. So in democratic societies, distasteful beliefs are not necessarily illegal, but distasteful beliefs that incite violence or criminal behavior are, right? So an examination of the laws with an eye to the line between lawful and unlawful behavior is important. Again, this is room for debate and room for discussion. Much of what I'm talking about, and I think was alluded to earlier from other comments from the panelists, is related to domestic issues. So since the manifestation of much of this ultra right-wing phenomena that you're asking about is currently not transnational in nature. Of course, there are some examples of transnational organizations and behaviors, but frankly speaking, the massive foreign terrorist threat that we saw in Syria and Iraq, so the foreign terrorist fighter threat, and the ballooning of networked, localized threats, that created this impetus, a great impetus for vectors of cooperation on security and diplomacy and development. We don't have that same level of sustained pressure at the moment needed to have a global focus on other types of terrorism that are emerging, so including the one that you're describing. And I would say that the pandemic has really sucked a lot of air out of the room and focused the world's attention on other priorities. I think kind of putting a cap on my comment, though. I mean, if you're trying to get some energy behind an effort to counter this type of terrorism, then the same hallmarks that we have with any other type of terrorism are important. So good analysis, intelligence sharing across countries, and then a steady drumbeat of the risks and the vulnerabilities will help keep countries both domestically and internationally focused and aligned. But I won't deny it's an uphill battle to paint this as a priority amidst all of the other priorities that are out there at the moment. But nonetheless, if we want to pay attention to what's potentially around the corner rather than being reactive, then I think it's important to understand, again, the parameters of the threat and what the potential solution set is for that threat.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Professor Farrell. And let me just repeat your action plan. It was really straightforward, very simple. I hope legislators and policymakers will take this into consideration. We said define the threat. We need to understand the push and pull factors, why people are joining such groups, either it's far-right or jihadi movements, and make a public discussion of what we could do as a society. And I really like this action plan. It was really simple, really straightforward. I know we have COVID-19 happening. There's so many challenges existing in the world, but we need to always be, as you said, proactive, and to also be able to predict based on history. History always repeats itself, according to my mother, as it's always said. Allow me to continue with our third question. It's going to be addressed to Dr. Pittman. If the internet is the fourth dimension of warfare, would you say that the Euro-Atlantic alliance is fragmenting between Euro-Atlantic partners and the Anglosphere? And what does that mean for our ability to deal with the global terrorist threats, Dr. Pittman?
Yes, definitely. We observe a difference of opinions between the different Euro-Atlantic partners. And these different opinions are mostly regarding, concepts such as privacy, security, and of course, how they should be best balanced, right? Especially in the age of big data and AI. But we're used to talking about state actors, especially when we're discussing the Euro-Atlantic community. But there's something about the cyberspace that is unique and different, and this is the non-state actor, the non-state component to the Euro-Atlantic community. And these are the Silicon Valley big tech companies with influence not only in the US, in Europe, of course, but everywhere in the world. So we definitely need to keep them in mind when we're discussing this issue. And it's not only a transnational issue with the big tech companies, as they're basically everywhere in the world, but it's also an internal issue for the United States, because the United States still hasn't resolved its big tech companies problem. We see a lot of core battles regarding encryption, regarding different issues that arise, especially in terms of terrorism. And of course, the problem can be somewhat mitigated and to some extent resolved if the United States actually comes with more regulations for the big tech companies. And what I mean by regulation is a little bit more clarity about their responsibilities, about their rights also. And this is going to signal to the European partners what they can expect from the big tech companies. Now, traditionally, we have observed a very close cooperation between the United States and Europe in terms of terrorism, but a very important component in this cooperation in the future will be the big tech companies and their role, right? Especially in terms of surveillance and intelligence and balancing these things with privacy concerns of citizens, data protection. And it's very interesting. I think that in the future, the big tech companies are gonna collaborate with, the different states regarding, significant threats of terrorism, or, after a serious I hope not, but after a series of terrorist attacks, they will cooperate, but on a case-by-case basis. It's not going to be a solid, full cooperation. We're going to see every now and then, these big tech companies having to go to court so that they don't allow the different governments to break their encryption, the encryption that they provide for their devices. And yes, to respond to your second question, the Euro-Atlantic community will probably still join forces in the fight against terrorism, but when it comes to the big tech companies, they will cooperate, they will comply, of course, with court orders, but there will be some boundaries that will be observed mostly in terms of encryption, because if the big tech companies actually provide a backdoor, a constant backdoor for the law enforcement and for the governments to break the encryption of their devices. This will, and if of course the news get public, this will mean a serious hit to their business. Mm-hmm. And I don't think the US government in particular is ready to risk this happening. So maybe a case-by-case basis, and we're probably still going to see a lot of cooperation going on between the partners, even though the big tech companies and their regulation will be a very contentious moment.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your answer, Dr. Pittman. And we need to modernize this outdated legislation regarding the cyber warfare and the cyber world in general, and how we can regulate our companies regarding data and what consumers and customers' rights. What kind of rights they have and how we can protect people's rights across the world. Thank you very much. And last but not least, allow me to end this beautiful discussion with one more question addressed to Professor Singleton. There is a talk of a Cold War comeback, but in a multipolar world order. By definition, that means less consensus over international legal norms. In this international context, Professor Singleton, is there a clear distinction between state-sanctioned covert violence and terrorism? Is it about what is done or who does it?
There is no clear line. Covert action means anything done secretly, not acknowledged by the perpetrator. It can include terrorist activities. For example, blowing up apartment buildings near Moscow in 1999. We don't know who in that case the perpetrator was. Putin accused Chechens, but others think it was the Russian security services looking for an excuse for a second Chechen war. It certainly was terrorism. Most covert activity, espionage, sending weapons to proxies, recruiting agents, internet hacking and penetration, is not terrorism. Terrorism, on the other hand, can be open as well as covert to achieve maximum publicity and scare people into submission. Islamic State terrorism was very public. Most terrorism is secretly planned, then acknowledged. The 9/11 attacks are an example. The reference to Cold War and covert action by states implies that terrorism is only the activity of non-state actors. Now, I have always thought this was nonsense, an idea promoted by governments, including the United States, to excuse their own activities. My listserv of top Middle East experts from many countries recently had a long discussion about how to define terrorism and went round and round about whether states could be called terrorist with no conclusion. Iran and Israel were prominently featured. So were US drone attacks and the Saudi bombing of Yemen. Now, I think terrorism is pretty simple. It's the deliberate use of violence against innocent people to achieve political ends. It works by garnering publicity, instilling fear and passivity and distrust, and by provoking counterattacks by the evil enemy. States can certainly do this. Lenin organized the Cheka to unleash red terror, his phrase, throughout Soviet Russia. In World War II, the Germans bombed London, and the British and Americans bombed German cities to terrorize the population. The US firebomb raids on Japan, a country of wooden houses, were more lethal than the atomic bombs and were openly justified as mass killing to encourage Japanese surrender. The most awful exercise of terrorism recently has been the Syrian government's attacks on Syrian citizens in rebellion, bombing, with Russian participation, schools and hospitals, and murdering tens of thousands in government prisons. In South Vietnam, to terrorize the population, the Viet Cong went around at night knocking on the doors of government supporters and took them outside and shot them. At the same time, in the same place, South Vietnamese government teams and the CIA went around and killed supporters of the Viet Cong. Operation Phoenix is one terrorism, but not the other. Now, I think today Islamist non-state terrorism is fading, although it will be with us for some time and may flare up in unexpected places like Mozambique. Jihadis have generally become local rebels dispersed in far-off places, Mali, Niger, Nigeria, Mozambique, Somalia, Sinai, Syria, or Afghanistan, or lone wolves in Europe or occasionally the United States, more than organized criminal networks mobilized from a command center. State covert activity is not fading. It is increasing or continuing. The Russians and the Israelis are the champs. The Turks and Americans and Iranians and Chinese and British and many others are much in the game. Most of it is online, hacking and espionage and infiltrating networks. Use of actual violence as a form of covert action, what the Russians call active measures, now mostly targets government officials and defectors. Hence the Israeli-linked assassination of Iranian nuclear scientists or the Russian murder of defectors in Britain. Or the US killing by drone of Iranian Revolutionary Guards Quds Force commander Qasem Soleimani. This raises another conceptual question. Is targeting government officials and soldiers and police terrorism? Now, I just forget the definitions. Definitions just get you going round and round, and would think that targeting officials but not bystanders is in fact different, whatever it's called, from setting off bombs on airplanes or in crowded markets. Another activity, by the way, now on the rise is hostage taking by governments. Here the Iranians top the league with more than a dozen. The Chinese have started to get in the game, detaining Canadians and Australians and claiming that Meng Wanzhou, the chief financial officer of Huawei and daughter of Huawei's founder, held in Canada facing extradition to the United States, is a hostage. In a US-China Cold War, we can expect a great deal of cyber war, internet infiltration, hacking, online espionage. I don't think that in present circumstances, either the US or China sees active measures using violence as particularly useful against the other, although this could change. I think as US-China relations heat up or freeze down, depending on which metaphor you prefer, the NSA, the National Security Agency, not the CIA Directorate of Operations, will be on the front line. A new Cold War won't be like the old one. Let me end by saying I'm an optimist. I think the West is resilient. I think the United States is resilient. I can't forget the early 1970s with our Soviet friends talking constantly about the changing correlation of forces, which never quite happened. I think the West and the Americans learn from mistakes. And I think that on the right side of values, we are on the right side of values if in fact we live up to them. And I think a lot of the recent troubles have been in fact caused by greater efforts to live up to them. And I also think that at the basic level, those values appeal to all people in all societies. So I'm an optimist.
In the future, and I'd like to thank you all wholeheartedly for your time and sharing of knowledge for those especially challenging topics. Your views are greatly valued and appreciated. Thank you very much for being here.
Thanks, Karina.
Thank you, Karina.
Thank you for inviting us.